thing PDF. And the group is now known as Act for Democracy. And he's done an amazing amount of work for Quorum's two teams, both the legislative as well as the CEE, or Climate, Energy, and Environment team. And he's just been a wonder working for those two groups. We've also just learned tonight that he is apparently an international Frisbee champion or something like that, which he can tell you more about. There you go. He's shaking his head. All right. We're really grateful to have him as part of COIN, as well as our moderator tonight. Jeff, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Terry. Well, so I do get to introduce our incredible panel here. But before I do that, I've been asked to spend about 4 minutes to give it kind of an introductory stage setting comments. So, and I'm going to be wearing just a little bit of an academic hat for that, not my policy advocacy hat, but my retired PSU professor hat. So here we go. So all state legislatures require a specific number of members to be present to conduct official business, such as debating or voting on legislation, right? The minimum numbers of members required to conduct official business is known as a quorum. When a coordinated group of legislators, typically consisting primarily of those in the minority party, leave the state capitol to prevent a quorum, well, this is known as a legislative walkout. All right, fair enough. Now, most states, 45 of them in fact, and Congress define a quorum simply as a majority of its members. This means the majority party can typically maintain a quorum without any minority party support, right? Oregon joins Indiana, Tennessee, and Texas as the only states that define a quorum as two-thirds of the members of a legislative chamber. The text on the quorum rule in the Oregon Constitution, by the way, was copied directly from Indiana's Constitution. Now, since our quorum rule is set forth in our state constitution, it can only be changed by the voters. State legislature itself can't do that. During the past legislative session, Oregon had the longest walkout in our state's history and the second longest walkout in any state in our nation's history. Technically, this was the 10th walkout in Oregon's legislative history, and all the recent walkouts in Oregon have been led by Republicans with occasional support from independents. They include the long walkout this past spring, of course, a walkout on COVID restrictions back in February of 2021, one on redistricting in September of 21, two walkouts on climate bills, one in June 2019, the second one in February of 2020, and a walkout to protest school funding package in May of 2019. So that's a total of 7 walkouts during a 4-year period. So we misquoted. We had the number too low in our promotional material, but I went and checked. So Democrats have conducted a few walkouts of their own when they were in the minority. For an example, in 2001, House Democrats staged a walkout to prevent Republicans from redrawing state legislative districts in ways the Democrats saw as extremely unfair. And in 1971, House and Senate Democrats walked out after Republicans refused to consider the federal constitutional amendment to lower the voting age to 18. So Democratic walkouts have been rare, even when they were in the minority party, but they have happened. Now, as we all know, in November of 2022, the citizens of Oregon passed Measure 113, and its intent was to add language to our Constitution that would prevent any lawmaker from running for re-election if they have 10 or more unexcused absences in a single legislative session. It also prevents wayward lawmakers from winning office in the other legislative chamber. The measure was supported by a majority of voters in every Senate district and by 68% of the voters statewide. But as a result of some wording issues, it's being challenged in court. Now, regardless of how the courts rule on that, many Democratic legislators, including the 3 on this panel, have indicated that we need to take the next step to change our quorum rule to a simple majority like nearly every other state. So they introduced HJR 30 towards the end of last session to refer this issue to the voters. It did not pass, but it did suggest a path forward. Most likely, it would not pass in a future session, at least in the near term, because given the slim Democratic majorities in both chambers, since it would almost certainly trigger another Republican walkout. This may mean that an expensive and time-consuming citizens initiative, complete with extensive voter education, would be our best option. So here we are, attempting to wade through our options, the pros and cons of each, and at least beginning the process of figuring out how we should proceed. And we do have a fantastic panel of experts to help us out here. And I think someone is going to be sending a link with all of their bios. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time repeating what you're going to get if you look at the chat. But I'll just a few highlights here. Representative David Gomberg is now in his 6th term representing House District 10. His district is a big one. It stretches from Lincoln City to Junction City, from Florence to Falmouth, covering Lincoln and portions of Western Lane and Benton counties. Representative Gomberg serves as co-chair of the Full Ways and Means Budgeting Committee and co-chair of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Economic Development. He also serves on a whole bunch of important boards, commissions, and trusts that I would spend the rest of the evening listing, so I won't, but a lot of them. And I was excited to realize that David also owns and operates a company that manufactures and flies kites. He has performed for Walt Disney, the Super Bowl, the London Millennium Celebration, and in 40 other countries. In 2005, he was introduced in the Kite Hall of Fame. So clearly we have a Renaissance man on our panel. And by the way, he sent me some pictures of some of these kites. They're absolutely incredible. All right, Senator Michael Dembrow, the chair senator representing District 23. Senator Dembrow has served in the Oregon legislature, first in the House and then in the Senate since 2008. Now that's 25 years, folks. Michael has been such a steady hand and inspirations for many of us for all of those years. He's retiring and he deserves to do so. But I should confess, Senator Dembrow, that I tried to get a resolution passed that would forbid you from doing so at least for a few more terms. Of course, the Republicans threatened yet another walkout, so I didn't get very far. Oh, well. Okay, Representative Confam, is Representative Pham here now? Has she joined us? I'm hoping she will, because I know maybe someone else can check in with her and see what's going on. She is in her 2nd term representing House District 6. That's the J District and much of Southeast Portland. And she's been a wonderful champion for climate justice, healthy, inclusive democracy, and an economy centered on well-being rather than profit. Now, the good news is that she recently announced that she is running for Senate District 28, Senator Dembrow's seat. So I'm confident she will be able to continue to be a very effective advocate for the many issues we care about on the Senate side. Michelle Ruffin. Michelle took the duties of the executive director of our Oregon just recently, May 1st, bringing a decade of deep experience advancing critical progressive policies in coalition, on the ballot, and at the legislature. She's a proven progressive leader who knows how to make connections, build power in marginalized communities, and deliver transformational policy wins. And as you probably all know, our Oregon was formed way back 18 years ago and continues to serve as a strategic leader and coalition coordinator in the state's progressive political area, with an emphasis on ballot measures and getting out the votes. I'm just getting to know Michelle. We've had a few conversations this last weekend, and I'm looking forward to getting to know her better. Dan Meek, I have known Dan for quite a while. He's an award-winning Portland-based public interest attorney. He graduated from Stanford Law School back in '78, was a law clerk to Chief U.S. Judge James Burns, legal counsel for the California Energy Commission, staff director for 2 committees in Congress. Oh, it's just a whole bunch of fascinating jobs. And among many other things, Dan has represented electricity ratepayers, public interest groups, energy efficiency companies in proceedings, both the federal agencies and before Oregon, Washington, California, Nevada, Idaho, and probably other states as well. So as you can see, we have a fantastic panel. Now I get to turn. We basically have 5 minutes for each of our speakers, up to 5 minutes for each of our speakers to provide introductory comments. So we'll have plenty of time for Q&A and discussion. So I'd like to turn us to Representative Gomberg.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, and thank you to everybody here tonight for your interest in this question of critical importance to the future of our democracy here in Oregon. And just to start with a quick footnote, if I may, Jeff, you mentioned that we copied our Constitution from Indiana. And the reason we copied our Constitution from Indiana is because the Indiana Constitution didn't allow Black people to stay there or vote there. So let's just put that piece of our awkward and unfortunate history in the back of our minds as well as we move forward to see how we're going to deal with the problem before us. And the problem before us, 7 walkouts in 4 years. Look, we've had walkouts over climate change. We've had walkouts over funding for schools. We've had walkouts over redistricting. We've had walkouts over guns, abortion, or whether 8th graders can understand the bills that we're voting on in Salem. More walkouts than any other state, longer walkouts than ever before, and it's time for it to stop, which is why I stepped up and was one of the chief co-sponsors of the resolution to turn to a simple majority as a solution to the walkout dilemma. Look, we all voted for Measure 113. We thought we had a solution. It's not turned out as well as we hoped it would, so we're looking for some alternatives. Now, all of that being said, Jeff, you know that I was expecting to go third tonight, and so I've been kind of quickly rewriting my comments in my head here since you asked me to go first. And what I wanted to share with you folks is this. I don't live in red Oregon. I don't live in blue Oregon. I live in purple Oregon. I'm the only elected Democrat on the entire Oregon coast. I work in a swing district, and that gives me a slightly different perspective on some of these questions. And the thing I would say to all of you is, under the current rules, are there any issues that you would walk out over? I mean, would you walk out over reproductive freedom? Would you walk out over same-sex marriage? Would you walk out over book banning? And so is it any surprise that if the rules allow it, that some of our colleagues choose to walk out over issues that they feel very strongly about as well? This is a process issue, and we have to respond to it in process terms. Let me say that to you another way. It's easy to characterize this as a problem created by the Republicans. It's easy to do that, and perhaps it's even a little bit of fun to do that sometimes, but I don't think it's practical to do that, and I say that for a couple of reasons. First of all, I'm really tired of having people respond to me, well, you know, the Democrats did it too. Yeah, it's been a while, but it's true. The Democrats have walked out, so we've got that to contend with. We've got the fact that some of the independents in the Senate have walked out recently. But I want to be a little more pragmatic with you than that, and that is to say to you that there are Republican voters who don't like walkouts. And if we make this about the GOP, then we lose their support, and I want their support. More importantly, there's an awful lot of non-affiliated voters out there, and the only thing that they dislike more than the walkouts is all the partisan squabbling in Salem. So I don't want to make this about the GOP. I want to make this about winning. I hope I'm being very clear about that. And I come again to you, as I said, from a swing district perspective. So what do we do about it? I mean, we came forward with a proposal last session to shift over to a simple majority, as most states do, that would make walkouts irrelevant. Well, the question is that a winning formula for us? We've got the benefit of some polling that was done 2 years ago. We expect that circumstances have changed in the last 2 years. But generally speaking, what we know from polling 2 years ago is that voters understand walkouts. They don't understand technical terms like quorum. And rather than changing the procedural rules, they're more interested in, wait for it, punishing legislators. Come up with a proposal that punishes legislators, and you've got a winning formula, which is why we went with 10 unexcused absences and you can't run again. Well, we're going to see how that plays out in the courts. I hope it plays out as we expected it to do, as Oregon voters believed it was supposed to, but that's an unanswered question at this point. If we're going to talk about quorum reform, perhaps we should also talk about pairing quorum reform together with another issue, related issue, that the voters might understand more easily. For example, should we bring forward a measure that says 10 unexcused absences and you're out immediately, not waiting for the next election, not waiting until your term ends, you're out the day after your 10th unexcused absence, and putting that together with a measure that also says, and by the way, quorum is a simple majority. That might be a winning formula. We've got some work to do to find out whether the current polling and the current attitude of voters has shifted, and where we can find a winning formula to solve this significant problem and threat to our democracy. And I'm going to close with this, folks, and that is, you know, when a small group of people run things, You don't have a republic anymore. You have an oligarchy. We need a democracy that works for all Oregonians. We show up, we debate, we negotiate, we compromise, and we vote. That's the way it's supposed to work. But we need a quorum, a reform that allows that to work so that a small group of people can't upend the whole process and trash a session as they've done the last two. So, Jeff, I'm going to stop at this point. I'd like to talk about polling, but I think we'll do that during questions and answers. I'm excited to hear from some of our other panelists.
That would be wonderful. And I was just trying to connect with Representative Vaughn. I have not reached her yet, so I'm not sure what's going on there, but hopefully she will join us soon. And we do get to turn to Senator Dembrow.
Thank you very much, Jeff. And thank you, David, for that background, which really covered a lot of ground. And so I'll try to sort of fill in some of the gaps from my perspective. It's ironic. Just a few weeks ago, I was at the National Conference of State Legislatures annual meeting, and it was held in Indianapolis. And so I had the pleasure of touring the Indiana State Capitol. Beautiful building. I would really encourage you to visit it. It's just, beautiful wood and different furnishings. It's really quite beautiful. And I enjoyed touring it, but all I could think about was, boy, here I am at the home of our quorum dilemma, because it was Indiana, as David and Jeff mentioned, that included in their constitution this really unreasonable 2/3 quorum requirement, unlike what we see. Yeah, unlike what we see in Congress. Our U.S. Constitution has a simple majority. The constitutions of nearly every other state have a simple majority. Our committees, in the legislature can do their business with a simple majority. And that, I will say, is what was one of the things that was so bizarre about our last experience, our most recent experience with the walkout, which is that while we were in the Senate unable to do business, our committees were meeting as they regularly do. And actually, ironically, and, I think, I don't know, it was very difficult for us, but we would have our Republican colleagues coming to committee for meetings and then somehow disappearing when it came time to go to the floor and form a quorum. And, as you can imagine, there were a number of hard feelings. At the end of the day, it helped that our committees were able to meet because we were able to take those bills that came to us from the House, which never walked out this time, and that, we're still coming out of the Senate, do the committee work, get them ready to pass. And so, it almost happened that none of these bills passed. But fortunately, once we were able to end the walkout, we were prepared to pass 300 bills, more than that, in just a week. Now, I will say that is no way to run a democracy, because what that meant was we had no time for debate on the floor. We had no time for discussion. It was really, although we heard a lot from our Republican colleagues that they were walking out because Democrats were getting in the way of democracy. Clearly, the opposite was the case. I was very much involved in the first Republican walkout of the recent era. I was the chief sponsor of the Cap and Invest bill that caused them to walk out in 2019. It was not only Cap and Invest, they also walked out over education funding and also a gun safety bill. They only came back after the Senate president agreed to kill Cap and Invest for that session, which, as you can imagine, was very painful for me personally and for many of us. But it was what it was, as they say, and we went to work to try to redo the bill and to make it to be in a form that would be more palatable to our Republican colleagues. We worked hard. We had a lot of discussions with some of our Republicans in the room, and we ended up coming up in 2020 with a new version of the bill that I think actually was not only more palatable to our Republican colleagues, but I think had a clearer path to passage. And we thought that that was going to lead to success in our short 2020 session. And then they walked out again. But this time, not only did they walk out, and this was both chambers, they walked out, but they never returned. And that, I will say, was a shock. And the idea, I mean, it was one thing, Jeff mentioned the Democrats walking out briefly in 2001 when the Republicans were trying to really contravene the system of redistricting. They were clearly messing with the process in a way that was anti-democratic. But ultimately, that was resolved and the session continued. But this idea of actually being willing to kill a session, sorry, I'm closing my window, was just, something that we really never counted on. But I will say, and let me also mention that in 2020, we ended up at the end of the session when we were still hoping that they would return, but it seemed pretty clear that they wouldn't. We drafted a resolution, much like the one that was drafted at the end of this session, saying that one needed a quorum, one needed a simple majority to make a quorum. Of course, that was never able to be voted on because the Republicans never returned. And so I think, the prognosis that if we were to introduce this in our upcoming short session, the Republicans would walk over that. I think that's a fair bet. And I think it's something we really need to take seriously. I'm not saying that we shouldn't introduce it and discuss it, debate it, that it should be out there. But, at the end of the day, I think we're, if we do want to move forward with it, it will likely kill the session. So that's something we need to think about. One of the things that I want to leave you with, and I look forward to responding more directly to questions, but I do want to say that one of the things that I learned during this walkout experience was that back in 2001, one of our Republican legislators at the time, Lane Shetterly, I don't know if any of you know Len or remember Lane. If you know or remember Lane, Republican, I would say a different kind of Republican than one finds in the Senate these days. But he made the comment, he cautioned us, and remember, it was the Democrats who walked out, and he cautioned us not to use this tactic ever again, because once that tactic is accepted, it will always be expected. And that has come to become our reality, actually. And you may or may not remember that 2021, the Senate never did walk out during our long 2021 session, even though we did some gun safety legislation. We passed that session. And two of our Republican colleagues faced recall elections because they did not walk out. That was the reason that they were recalled. They survived the recalls, but I can tell you they never forgot that. And that is why really we need to figure out a way to change this quorum requirement and to make it a simple majority so that they never find themselves in that position where, I think that one or two of them really did not like the idea of walkout. But in being responsive to some elements in their district, they felt that they needed to walk out. And I will say that we did hear when we heard Republicans complaining about Measure 113 and saying that it was flawed and it should be overturned. We did hear from them that, look, if you want to end the quorum, if you want to change this quorum requirement, change this quorum requirement. Don't use the approach that was there in Measure 113. And so I think I agree with them. That's what we need to do. And what we'll be doing tonight, I look forward to it, is exploring how can we do that. And I look forward to your questions and to your suggestions. No, you're on mute, Jeff.
I am on mute. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you so much, Senator Dembrow. I believe I see a message that Representative Pham is here. Is that correct?
She's here, yes.
Yay. Okay, I haven't seen her photo, but okay, so fantastic. You are on next, my friend. You are on next.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today to speak with you. My name is Con Pham. I'm the state representative for Oregon House District 46, representing Outer Southeast Portland. Rep. Gomberg and Senator Dembrow have done a wonderful job of explaining the many terrible and damaging impacts of the quorum on our legislative processes and our ability to have a functioning state government. So I wanted to talk a little bit about my personal experience as a legislator in terms of how it also impacts our ability to even maintain and keep legislators in office. I think being able to retain some experience in the legislature is really key. And I also wanted to just talk a little bit about what it would look like to build a coalition that can pass this initiative at the ballot. As Senator Dembrow mentioned, the pathway through the legislature is doubtful, even though it can be a helpful tool for messaging. We will ultimately likely have to go to the ballot in order to pass this constitutional amendment. I wanted to just share, sometimes stories can be really helpful. And I think, I often share many of the same stories that you've heard earlier today about how this is, obstructing our ability to pass the most basic and fundamental policies, even educational budgets. I mean, there was a moment during the legislature when we really didn't know if certain school districts would have enough budget to hold their programming in July, the summer programming that they needed. There was a chance that we weren't even going to be able to pass our education budgets. And I really think it's important for us to hold that. Now it's easy in hindsight to just feel like that risk was minimal, but during that time, it was a very real risk that we just weren't going to be able to reach a negotiation, and that the Republicans were willing to sacrifice even millions of dollars going to their district in order to block these other bills that they didn't support. And as legislators, that has a both damaging also to our legislative process, but it's also to our ability to want to continue to stay in office, because we make tremendous sacrifices as legislators, taking time away from our families, taking time away from our work. We're making financial sacrifices to be able to accept this work, and to just each year, each session, face a tiny number, a handful of people who are able to just block years and years of work is tremendously demoralizing. And so that's one of the personal reasons that I bring such fire to this, because I believe in our democracy. I did not start in this work as a pro-democracy politician. I care about climate justice. I care about transportation and housing and education and racial justice, environmental justice. And it took me a while to realize that if we don't fix both campaign finance reform of democracy, but also if we don't fix this quorum, every single issue that I care about is at risk. And so I really wanted to have a conversation today about what it means to build a big tent coalition that is powerful enough to take this issue on. And while it is not going to be easy, this is going to be a fight that likely Republicans are going to fight tooth and nail. But I think it also offers us the opportunity to build the kind of alliances and intersectional coalitions that we often don't build because we don't see our shared interests. But I think the quorum issue really unites people who care about reproductive justice, people who care about trans rights, LGBTQ rights, people who care about making sure our schools get adequate funding, people who care about climate resilience and making sure that we're taking climate action. I mean, pretty much any issue that Democrats care about, that just, I would say anybody in a nonpartisan way, so many people care about education, and so many people across our state just need, in this time of multiple crises, need a functioning state government to be able to respond to the growing crises that we have. This issue has the potential to unite all of them if we're able to provide the right messaging, the right education that really makes sense to the public, that connects, their inability, or, the state government's need to build housing and their inability to find affordable housing with walkouts and with the quorum reform. We have to tell that narrative and really make those dots, connect those dots. But once we are able to do that, I think it's an opportunity to really to build a powerful coalition that hopefully can help us build powerful coalitions for other big wins that we need. I started out in my political career working on another ballot measure initiative, admittedly at the city level, which is a much easier terrain to fight on. But I think it's still a helpful lesson, because similarly, it involved coalitions that had never worked together. So I was in APANO, the Asian Pacific American Network of Oregon, and we had never before worked with groups like the Sierra Club or Audubon Society or 350 PDX. Like, they were, we often saw them as kind of more privileged, white, mostly white, often older folks who didn't really necessarily care or show up for our issues when it comes to immigrant rights, or when it comes to fighting on educational equity, or culturally specific healthcare access, and all these other issues. Like, there just hadn't been that opportunity to work together. There was a lot of mistrust. But through the Portland Clean Energy Fund, we took a lot of time to actually build trust, talk about shared values, come to memorandums of understanding about how leadership would be followed. And we were able to build a very powerful coalition that included BIPOC organizations working with traditional, more mainstream and grassroots environmental organizations. And then we built it to include neighborhood associations and small businesses, to build that kind of big tent coalition that was able to go up against some of the most powerful, wealthiest corporations in the world, including Walmart and Comcast, to pass a 1% business license surcharge on billion-dollar corporations that now is funding and raising $100 million a year in the city of Portland through the Portland Clean Energy Fund. So I know that the city of Portland, we purposely chose it because it has a progressive population. I'm not saying that the makeup of the city is at all comparable to the makeup of the state of Oregon, but I am saying that we are in a moment now where this issue has an opportunity to unite different constituencies that traditionally don't get to work together. And I think we're also in a moment of political upheaval where the rules of politics are shifting, often in terrible new precedents that are being formed that we thought were impossible that are now possible, but also in creating opportunities for new things that maybe were impossible to also be possible on our side. So I want to encourage us to think about the kinds of coalitions that we can build, because for me, even if right now, you know, the electorate may not understand fully the problem that our current status quo quorum presents, but as crises
So we're losing you at the moment. You froze. Let's see. So I think
maybe turn off
on each other and continue to pound. And
there
our
we go.
Is
There we go. Oops. Okay, I think we got the point, and it was very, very effective. So I'm going to now turn us to, we're really now have two more speakers, and they're going to be really focusing more on the process, rather than the policy. So I'm going to ask Michelle Ruffin to join us next to talk up from the perspective of her wonderful organization. Any guidance you can give us on next steps, issues, problems, what we should be looking at, etc.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Michelle Ruffin, I'm she, her pronouns. I'm with Our Oregon, and it's really great to be with you all tonight. I guess I will say before I sort of jump right into some process things to think about, you know, I always like to lay the groundwork by saying, here's what we know. We all know Oregon voters do not support walkouts by and large, right? We know 34 of 36 Oregon counties, including communities that the Senate Republicans represent, overwhelmingly supported Measure 113. And I think that sends a clear message. I know it was something that we very much named, along with a lot of advocacy partners and probably many of you during the walkouts, that there was a clear message sent. And it's just really important that we know that, and what do we do about it now, right? Implementation is ongoing. There's efforts right now to take this to the Oregon Supreme Court, and we believe that the court will see what we and Oregon voters saw. But, you know, just to say, right, folks will not give up a tool that works. So walkout senators, you know, will walk out and not come back, even with consequences, until it becomes wholly uncomfortable to do so. So I just wanted to name, you know, the important things about that I think the role of many folks on this call have is the communities that, whether you're from one of these districts or not, there are ways to continue to make this very uncomfortable. Using your voices as constituents to name what's at stake, actions at the Capitol, approaching folks in town halls, like even if we expect that there may be more of this, really we want to continue to do that because it helps to make that connection that I think the good senator and Representative Pham were getting at. What it does is connect our frustrations and the damaging impacts of walkouts to the understandings of the rule that creates this tool for folks to walk out. So I did want to name, so as you know, Our Oregon, one of the big pieces of expertise we bring into spaces like this is the initiative petition requirements process. If there are citizen initiatives, in this case, trying to think about how you move such a thing, I think I wanted to name that there's just multiple steps in that process. And I know that Dan Meek can sort of speak to some of this as a chief petitioner on many things as well. But there's a set of things you move through, right? There's the initial sort of chief petitioner files a prospective initiative and then receives a sponsorship template and a working title. There are sponsorship signatures that are required, about 1,000 signatures required from registered Oregon voters that need to be submitted back to the Secretary of State's office. demonstrating that there are a set of folks really ready to do this. That after that goes, the Secretary of State will come back by, say, 10 or 20 business days or so to verify and then give a draft ballot title. The titling process, there's multiple steps inside the titling process that involve the Attorney General. There are comments made, the Supreme Court challenge, if there is a court challenge. And from start to finish, that can take months. So I did just want to name for folks that of course, we always tell folks in the process that the titling can take you anywhere from 3 to 6 months. And our required signature collection for statutory or constitutional, in this case, constitutional measures are well over, it's about nearly 150,000 signatures, right? And you'd probably want to gather more. So that often takes months and months in and of itself. So once you're done with the titling process, you then get cleared to collect signatures. And that signature collection process can take anybody from, 18 weeks to a year or more. So I just wanted to name that there's sort of a set of things that have to happen, that you have to be in compliance with. And then, of course, a set of things that come with all of the planning moving into a citizens initiative for something like this. So I'll pause. I know Dan may have some really important things to share too about his experience in this, and just wanted to name, a thank you to all of you for staying engaged on it.
Thank you, Michelle. And yes, Dan.
Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Very good. Well, on the matter of getting a measure on the 2024 ballot, it would be difficult and expensive at this point, but certainly doable if a measure were filed today and were accompanied immediately by the 1,000 valid sponsorship signatures that Michelle mentioned. The ballot title process would take a minimum of 2 months. It's a back and forth between the Attorney General writing a draft ballot title, comments, and then a certified ballot title. And after that, you can start collecting signatures after you have a certified ballot title, unless someone files a challenge of the ballot title with the Supreme Court. And I would say with a measure this important that a challenge would be filed, they always are. That will add another 2 to 7 months of delay before signature gathering can start. For example, our campaign finance reform statutory measure for 2024 recently experienced the 7 months of additional delay. So there was a total of 9 months of delay between the time we submitted the 1,000 sponsorship signatures and the time we were allowed to even collect one signature toward the required 120,000 for a statutory measure. By the way, the number has gone up, and for a constitutional measure like the one you're talking about, it's 160,000 valid signatures, which means probably you'd need 230,000 raw signatures. So considering the delay at the Supreme Court, which can take as long as it wants to resolve a ballot title challenge, then you're looking at beginning real signature gathering by mid-February at the earliest, or mid-June, probably at the worst, which leaves only from 1 to 5 months to gather the 230,000 raw signatures. I would say that's probably impossible to do with volunteers alone, and could easily cost over $1 million to use paid circulators. And even then, there might not be sufficient time, depending upon how long the Supreme Court takes to resolve the ballot title challenge. So it can be done, but I think that it needs to be done. It needs to be done quickly. And I'm kind of surprised that sort of the reason that we can't all rely on Measure 113 hasn't been mentioned at this meeting. And just the reason is that the language, of the measure is before the Oregon courts now. And I think there's a realistic possibility that the Oregon courts will hold that it does not preclude anyone from serving in the Oregon legislature before 2029. The actual language of the measure says it disqualifies the member from holding office as a senator or representative for the term following the election after the member's current term is completed. Well, for senators who were elected in 2020, their term officially ends in January of 2025. And the election after the member's current term is completed is the election in November 2028. So they would be precluded from serving beginning in January of 2029. That can be the result. That is what the text of the measure says. The ballot title is totally different. The ballot title says that the offending legislator is precluded from holding office as a legislator for the term following the current term of office. So it's a very strange situation where the ballot title is very different from the language of the measure, and it's up to the Supreme Court to decide which one to go with. But I would also point out that there is nothing at all in the ballot title that says that the measure precludes anyone from running and winning an election. It just talks about serving in office. And in fact, the explanatory statement, which I would say has more credibility than the ballot title, because the explanatory statement is done much later. It's done in August of the election year, after it is known that the measure will be on the ballot. And it's done by a panel of 5 persons, 2 appointed by the chief petitioners, 2 appointed by opponents who are selected by the Secretary of State, whomever the Secretary of State thinks represents the opponents, and a 5th member selected, by the 2 sets of 2, or if they can't agree, by the Secretary of State. So it's developed in a process that's supposed to be neutral, and it's also developed at a time when much more is known about the measure than was known when it was first filed and the ballot title process was done, which can be more than 2 years in the past. So the explanatory statement says, a candidate may run for office in the next primary and general election and win, but cannot hold office under this measure due to 10 or more unexcused absences. So if someone can run for office and win, let's say in the November 2024 election, what happens under the measure is that the office becomes vacant in January of 2025. And vacancies in legislative offices are filled in a particular way, where the central committees of the counties encompassing the district of the disqualified member, the central committees of that member's political party nominate 3 persons who are then goes to the county commissions for those counties, and they decide who serves. So it's a different consequence than some folks might have expected.
Thank you. Well, sobering. So I do have a set of questions that basically summarize the questions people sent in advance. We're a little low on time. It's 7:52 right now. But I also noticed we have some other distinguished people on this call, legislators. We have Senator Jeff Golden is on the call, and Representative Mark Gamba is on the call, and others. So, and there might be some others that I didn't notice, but I see that Senator Golden has raised his hand. So I'm going to ask him to ask the first question, and then I'll start going through the list from there.
Thank you. Dan, as you went through the timeline to get to the 2024 ballot, I think you said that a challenge to the courts would delay things 2 to 7 months. And that sounds decisive in terms of the ability to get to 2024. If it's 2 months, I can see us getting there. 7 seems really unlikely. So that's a pretty big range. Practically speaking, does anything we could do or ask for, or what could affect whether it's closer to 2 months or 7 months? Is there any process for requesting expedited review in this case? What could shorten that towards the 2-month end of the scale?
Well, you could certainly ask for that. In a ballot title challenge, the briefing takes almost no time, because the ballot title challenge itself, which is filed within 10 business days of the time that the Attorney General certifies the ballot title, it has to contain, it's basically an opening brief. And then response briefs have to be filed within 7 business days. And then the reply brief is filed within 5 business days. So the briefing is all done within a couple of weeks. unlike most cases before the Supreme Court, where briefing extends over a period of several months. So the problem is not the briefing schedule ordinarily. Well, it's never the briefing schedule, except sometimes parties will ask for extensions of time in the briefing schedule, which are typically granted, which takes more time. But the real problem is after the briefing is done, the Supreme Court can take as long as it wants. And in some cases, it takes several months. Even if it approves finally the ballot title that the Attorney General wrote, it still takes, the Supreme Court can still sit on it for several months. Then if the Supreme Court wants any change in the ballot title, it used to be that the Supreme Court would just make the change, change a few words here and there, and that's it. Here's the final ballot title. But the process was changed about 10 years ago, so that instead the Supreme Court sends the ballot title back to the Attorney General. And there's another week for the Attorney General to change it. And then there's another week for people to comment on that. And then there's another week for people to respond to the comments. So in the case of the campaign finance reform measure, it went through this, kind of laundry cycle of very small change and then another month of delay. So that's what can happen. This measure would be, I would think extremely short and simple. You would think that the ballot title could be resolved very quickly by the Supreme Court, within days. It could do that, but it has the authority to take as much time as it wants.
Okay, thanks, Dan. So I have a question. I'm going to butt in here and just ask one of the questions I got so many of these sorts of questions already that come along, and this tends to be directed more to you, Michelle. You talked about this a little bit in your opening comments, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more. What does the available polling data suggest about Oregonians' views about so many legislative walkouts? Does the existing data suggest that Oregonians do or don't understand the relationship between the many recent walkouts and the two-thirds quorum rule? What do we know so far, and what are the next steps?
Yeah, Jeff, I'll try to be as concise as I can because we've got a lot of questions. What the polling tells us, and this is 2-year-old polling, so I just want to name, right, that we have updates to do, and I think that would be that's important to know where the voters are now, especially after Measure 113. What it told us in 2021 was that Oregonians, by a wide margin, were very aware of the walkouts and were frustrated by the walkouts. And in that same survey, Oregonians of Oregon voters told us that changing a quorum rule to a simple majority, they were not necessarily willing to change that. I think it was about 38% support in that poll. And it just demonstrated for us, as we were looking back at these results, and partners, right, sharing that this connection between my frustration about senators walking out and walking off the job, for whatever reason that is not necessarily connected to the frustration around my understanding on procedure inside the Oregon Senate.
So it looks like education is going to be very, very important. So we're running out of time, but there's one question I have to ask because it really relates to everybody here. And here is that question. Since educating voters about the connections between the quorum rule and continuing walkout seems to be very important, what might a robust educational strategy look like? And then they add, what roles can progressive groups like Oregon's Indivisible groups, Multnomah Climate Action Team, faith-based groups, 350 Oregon groups, etc., groups concerned about gun safety, healthcare, housing, food security, and many other important issues. What role can all of these groups play in such an educational campaign? What role can the Oregon Democratic Party and more local Democratic Party organizations play in such an educational campaign?
Jeff, do you want to direct it at us?
I would love. Well, why don't you start, Representative? That would be great.
Great. This is the kind of broad-based issue that affects the entire state, and you can find a very easy connection to everybody. So I think that's exactly when we need when we need to have all of the different constituencies that were mentioned. I didn't get a chance to add when I was speaking before, but when we started, we had no experience in ballot measures. All of the groups that were at the table had never passed a ballot measure initiative before. We had no funding either. It was all pro bono volunteer work that is on top of our regular work. And people did not think that we had the experience to pass it. And traditionally, ballot measure campaigns were traditionally run with a campaign manager, a staff, a very experienced professional staff, and a budget. Like you gather, you pay for petition signers, you pay for campaign managers, campaign staffers, field directors, everything. We went by for the first 2.5 years with all volunteer staff. It wasn't until we had qualified for the ballot that we hired a campaign manager. We literally gathered 65,000 signatures already. So I just want to say that that's where grassroots efforts are so critical. Money is necessary. We're going to need money to pass this, because we still did end up having to get some petition signatures and get some paid petition signatures. But we found that those signature gatherers who were paid had a much lower rate of actual qualified signatures compared to the volunteer signature gatherers. And when we built a coalition that people were excited to be a part of, I will just be honest, like people were kind of intrigued. Like a lot of our kind of older retirees had never been part of a group that had like a lot of young people and more diverse, like BIPOC communities involved. And it was exciting to be a part of this effort. And so they were willing to spend weekends going to the street fair and gathering signatures. And, we recognize that each of us brought different strengths. Some people have time, some people have, communication skills or spokesperson skills and leadership skills. So we were able to really make sure that the frontline communities were at the leadership and communicating, but everyone has a role to play and has something to contribute. And so many people still remember that fondly as a time when they just gave up so many weekends just gathering signatures and talking to voters and door knocking, because it was part of this larger collective effort. And so that's the role that I see all of the individual groups and all of the reproductive justice rights groups and everybody playing, is we each kind of coming together, figuring out what our different resources that we can offer are, whether they are money, communication skills, time, volunteers with time, each of us coming together to figure out our strengths that we can contribute, and then coming up with a really powerful statewide coalition to do the education that's going to be needed.
Thank you. I see David, Representative Gumberg has raised his hand.
Yeah, and I'll be quick because I'm repeating myself a little bit, but let's start with this. Educating voters takes time and it takes money. It's hard. It's easier if you can start with some concepts that they already agree with you on, and you're probably going to lose a little bit before the election's over with, but you start with some things where they agree with you. I'm looking at the polling that Michelle was referring to earlier, and again, it's 2 years old, but a straight quorum vote barely passes. But if you pair it together with another issue, like consequences for walking out that the voters intuitively understand, we pick up 20 points. That's why I talk about the notion of trying to piggyback on an issue the voters already understand, in addition to trying to spend that time and money educating them.
Okay, so officially we have reached the 8:02 mark, according to my computer. We still have lots of great questions and so hands up and raised and so on. What I'm going to suggest, officially we can say this meeting is over, because we'd like to honor the timing. However, if the members of the panel are willing to stay a little longer, and those of you in the Zoom call can stay a little longer, let's go for another maybe 5-10 minutes. Is that okay? All right, so I'm going to assume that's okay, but if you need to leave, we certainly understand. So, wow. So I guess the next question, I've kind of been getting this from the chat and from other people who are sending me things. What's next? What are the next steps? What would be in the best possible? Do we wait until we find out where the courts decide? Do we go ahead and get started on an initiative? We've got some other initiatives that are being considered for the ballot. Do we wait till a following year? Do we let one option would be to bring this issue up in the next legislative session, have the Republicans walk out as they probably would, and that would shine a light on, maybe people would be, that would be additional piece of educational evidence to help voters understand and make that connection between a walkout and the quorum rule. What would, those of you on the panel, what would you see as the next steps? And I can direct it to any of you who would like to speak.
Spend some money and find out what voters think now, 2 years later.
Yep, a poll is really key. We are working, I was just in a meeting with Rep. Gomberg earlier today, along with Michelle and some other partners, both from labor as well as our community partners. And everyone agrees that we need to get, new polling data on where Oregonians are right now, what they think about the walkouts, what they think about quorum change. This, 2021 is an eon ago. It's before the Dobbs decision in Supreme Court, before all of the reproductive rights that we've fought so hard were at risk. And, the whole landscape has changed, and I think we need updated data. And from there, we can make a more educated guess about what's feasible and how long something is going to take. If it turns out, 70% of people now are there, then that changes our calculus, right? So we need to do the polling. So right now we're doing fundraising, and we're forming a group to figure out the polling scope and questions, so that we can make sure we get our questions answered.
Great first step. And what would be the next step?
Well, I'd just like to add, I think it'd be useful to have some qualitative data, not just quantitative data. We're all scratching our heads that 2 years ago, there was so much frustration with the walkouts, and yet so little support for this change. So we need to find out more about what that's about. And for our messaging, we need at least a couple good focus groups, in my opinion, to try to get to some of this.
Laura, you've been monitoring the chat. Are there any other burning questions we should bring up?
Well, there's been a couple of comments. Alan Journay and Ron Bunch both have made, I think, a really good point that the walkouts really impact Republican districts and negatively impact the voters in those districts. And so we might look at messaging to those voters as to how this is impacting them and how their goals can be achieved with compromise rather than these radical walkouts. So I don't know if anyone wants to speak to that, but those were made a few times in the chat, and I wanted to point that out.
And I see that Senator Dembro has raised his hand.
Well, I just want to remind us that as Michelle had mentioned, just how strong the support was for Measure 113. And it wasn't really so much the text of what was in 113, which obviously we wish had been more polished, but it was this idea that people, that elected officials are expected to show up for work and not to use the walkout tactic as a way to, to stop the process. And I think that I think the polling would be really, is really important, and that needs to be done right away. And I will say that anything that we can do to get this on the ballot in 2024 would be desirable, just because 2024 is a presidential year. We're going to have a lot of turnout, and more likely voters who will support this, along with issues such as campaign finance reform, if that's where we have to go with that, and some other good government measures. This could be part of a package of good government measures. And I think we need to see it that way. And I think that it matters less what is in, I think having it be around the change in the quorum is going to be more irrelevant, since people do now better understand their antipathy towards walkouts. And this would be framed in that way. This is how we end walkouts, by changing this quorum requirement. And if it's framed in that way, I think we can get a majority of support. Remember, this measure passed in every Senate district in the state, every single Senate district, and yet the senators walked out. But I think that's how it needs to be framed.
Thank you. So, folks, we are now approaching 8:10. I think we have done well, but I also want to honor our time commitments here. Obviously, there's more to think about here, but I think we made a really good start, and I wanted to. I'm so impressed with all of the questions. The panel members themselves, very thoughtful, and there's more. There's more down the road. Maybe we can get back together at some point and revisit this in a future conversation or in some other forum. But those of you who are still with us please join me in thanking our panel members. Fantastic job. Thumbs up. And thank you all. Is there one final comment, maybe Laura or anybody else from Coin Leadership wants to bring?
We just like to thank everyone for showing up tonight. This is so crucial. And it's so important that everybody get together and share their ideas and their opinions and their thoughts so that we can go forward in a way where we're a collective. And we're just happy as Indivisible to support whatever goes forward at this time in any way and with our small army. We really appreciate the people that showed up tonight as our panelists, and Jeff, you as well, for making this a really successful evening. This has been recorded and it will be on the Coin website probably tomorrow. If you want to see what people said, or if you want to share it with people in your groups.
Fantastic. That's great. I just saw that Debbie has mentioned that in the chat. That's fantastic. Well, thank you all very much. Have a wonderful evening, and let's get this resolved. Let's get this solved. We have our work cut out for us here. Thank you all very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you.
Moderating.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jeff.